Hey folks, apparently the French far-right party National Rally was implicated in the newly released Epstein file. There was this email exchange between Michael Wolff and Jeffrey Epstein. Now in it, this guy Michael Wolff mentions someone with the initials SP meeting with the French far-right wingers, including Le Pen's husband, about refinancing the National Front party, and that a good part of their money comes from Russia. To French people, this is probably nothing new, but this whole thing with the Epstein files made me check, and indeed, Marine Le Pen and the broader French far-right has a lot of connections with Russian oligarchs and Putin himself. Before we dive deeper in the French far-right's ties with Putin, I just want to posit a theory here. I'm starting to believe that almost every far-right party in Europe is bankrolled or supported in some other way by the Kremlin. For example, in Germany, AfD is literally the mouthpiece of Russian propaganda. The German domestic secret service did an investigation and reported that Russia is trying to destabilize the democratic system of Germany and push Russian narratives through the AfD, and are contributing to the expansion of right-wing extremism in the country. AfD members and activists were listed as keeping close ties with Russian politicians and receiving financial benefits in an OCCRP investigation of Russia's International Agency for Current Policy. There was also a leaked document from the SDA, the Social Design Agency. This is a Kremlin-linked entity running major Russian disinformation campaigns aimed at eroding Western support for Ukraine through fake content. Internal documents leaked from this entity showcase its goals of unsettling the population in the EU and destabilizing the democratic political system exactly through right-wing parties. It further mentions how in Germany the AfD should be strengthened. Specifically, a document sets the goal that the AfD should achieve approval of around 20% from a survey institute whose results are published throughout Europe and which is considered trustworthy. In Britain, you have ex-reform UK MPs admitting to taking bribes from Russia, directly taking money from Russia for making favorable statements in support of the Russian invasion into Ukraine. You literally have people taking Kremlin money to further the interests of the Russian regime. In Romania, you have extreme Russian influence trying to rig the presidential elections in favor of the Russian puppet Călin Georgescu and George Simion. They didn't even try to pretend in this one. I guess us Eastern Europeans are not worth the effort of making an elaborate and complex and veiled plan to destabilize democracy or something. Sure. So all over Europe, you have this pro-Russian filth being spread, especially by far-right parties. This is a very conscious and thought-out planned strategy by the Russians to destabilize democracies in Europe and make them do the bidding of the Kremlin. Just as an example, recently I found out that the reason the anti-nuclear energy campaign in Germany was so effective was because of a guy named Gerhard Schröder. He was Chancellor of Germany and a Russian asset, apparently, a chairman of the board of Rosneft and Nord Stream. He made tens of millions from Russian energy companies and pro-Putin lobbying. The goal of the lobbying was to ensure that Germany would be dependent on Russia for their energy, and he succeeded. His government officially instituted the phase-out of nuclear power in Germany. He introduced a law in 2002 to shut down all German nuclear power plants by 2022, which was, as we know, catastrophic for the Germans. But now let's get to the point of this video. Let's talk about France and how the far-right National Rally Party is allegedly run by the Russians. So as per the leaked Epstein file communication, apparently Le Pen's husband and other National Rally members were begging for money. This document mentioned also how they were getting funding from Russia. So there for sure is a financial tie between Putin and Le Pen's party. Le Pen herself was courting the Russian stooges long before. Since January 2011, she was repeatedly saying how cool Vladimir Putin was and how she absolutely supported his politics despite Putin horrifically violating human rights and international law at the time. Le Pen has visited Russia at least 4 times since 2013 and was welcomed like a royalty every goddamn time. She met with 2 important figures from the Duma, that's the lower house of the Russian parliament. Its president, Sergei Narychkin, who is a former KGB FSB member, and Alexei Pushkov, the president of the International Affairs Committee. During this visit, she condemned a kind of cold war against Russia conducted by the European Union. While she was in Russia, she also said that Russia is presented with demonized characteristics. She said, "I feel more in tune with this model of economic patriotism than with the EU's." I honestly cannot imagine how a presidential candidate can do a trip to Russia in 2013 and absolutely glaze Putin and still be popular. I just cannot imagine, like, how low do you have to get for some crumb of power? Jesus. She visited Russia again in 2014, this time after the annexation of Crimea. So there was a lot of sanctions being levied at Russian officials at the time. Of course, Le Pen didn't waste time to caress Putin's genitals, saying that she's against sanctioning Russians because it was counterproductive or something. In 2015, she did a third trip to Moscow, and in March of 2017, during her fourth visit, she was finally allowed to meet her senpai, Vladimir Putin. And this time, she was received by him. This was less than 4 weeks before the first round of the 2017 presidential election in France. According to Le Pen's team, the meeting was primarily intended to highlight Putin's and Le Pen's convergences of views, including on the fight against terrorism and the migration crisis then affecting Europe. I guess that wasn't enough, because she said further that she welcomed Russian forces' intervention in Syria and that, quote, her point of view on Ukraine coincides with that of Russia. She also reaffirmed her desire to lift international sanctions on Russian personalities. Le Pen has always had Russia sympathizers in her circle. Between 2010 and 2015, her international policy advisor, Aymeric Chapardet, I have no idea how to pronounce this, held multiple meetings with people close to Mr. Putin. After he left the National Rally, he hired Elisaveta Peskova, the daughter of the Russian president's spokesperson, as his parliamentary collaborator. In 2014, Marine Le Pen relied on Jean-Luc Schaffhauser to obtain financing from a Russian bank for the party. Schaffhauser was an international consultant with many connections in Russia and was, of course, a member of the European Parliament, because everybody can work there apparently. Today, the key figure in the relationship between National Rally and Russia is the member of the European Parliament, Thierry Mariani. If Marine Le Pen represents the face of the French far-right Russia problem, Thierry Mariani is the megaphone. Mariani is a long-time National Rally figure and former government minister. He has spent years acting as one of Moscow's most reliable little bitch inside European politics. He has repeatedly traveled to Russian-occupied Crimea, despite the annexation being illegal under international law. These trips weren't diplomatic missions sanctioned by France or the EU. They were political theater used by Russian state media to claim Western legitimacy. At the European Parliament, Mariani has consistently opposed sanctions against Russia. He even voted against resolutions condemning Russian aggression and framed Moscow as, quote, a victim of Western provocation. After the invasion of Ukraine, while mass graves and missile strikes dominated the news, Mariani focused instead on criticizing NATO and questioning Ukrainian resistance. In November 2018, Mariani traveled to Donetsk to act as an observer in the general elections in the Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic. Between November 2015 and November 2017, Mariani traveled to Syria 5 times for the purpose of meeting with Bashar al-Assad, who he called his friend. Some researchers have dubbed him Agent of Damascus for his role in the propagation of disinformation, particularly after Assad's chemical attacks, and in the dissemination of regime propaganda. In 2020, he called in a plenary session at the European Parliament to support the Assad regime to bring peace to the country and to, quote, exterminate the Syrian rebels. He also has ties to the Azerbaijani and Chinese governments. This is the kind of garbage human beings we're dealing with here. These are people with absolutely no morals and no scruples whatsoever. They would unironically sell their mothers as sex slaves if it meant securing more power. In 2014, National Rally, then the National Front, received a 9 million loan from the First Czech Russian Bank to bankroll its campaign for the 2015 regional and departmental elections. First Czech Russian Bank is an institution closely linked to Kremlin-connected interests. This came after French banks repeatedly refused to finance the party, citing financial and reputational risk. In other words, they just didn't want to finance the National Rally's campaigns. So basically, Russia stepped in where France would not and funded Le Pen's party. That fact alone is extraordinary to me. Think about it. A major French political party campaigning exactly on sovereignty and national independence, kept afloat by a foreign power, openly hostile to the European Union. And let me be clear about this. The Russian loan was a lifeline for Le Pen. Without it, the party's 2015 regional campaigns and 2017 presidential run would have been financially crippled. She would not have run if that wasn't the case. Supporters insist this was merely a business transaction, simply a loan, a donation with no strings attached. But politics, of course, doesn't run and doesn't work in vacuum, and neither does foreign money. Following the loan, Marine Le Pen and her party adopted positions that consistently aligned with Russian strategic interests. For example, recognition of Crimea's illegal annexation, opposition to the EU sanctions against Russia, calls to weaken NATO, and overall just rhetoric framing Russia as a victim of Western aggression. So this just reeks of quid pro quo, type of situation. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. Russia does not invest in European parties out of ideological curiosity. It does so exactly to fracture EU unity, weaken NATO, and legitimize its geopolitical ambitions. National Rally, in turn, benefited from financial lifelines and international validation at moments when it was politically isolated and on the verge of collapsing. This is how Russian influence works. It has been consistent and strategic. Russia wants to fund sympathetic parties, legitimize them internationally, and encourage positions that weaken the European Union and NATO cohesion. Le Pen's National Rally checked every box. When a party receives millions from Russian-linked institutions, defends Russian territorial expansion, opposes sanctions, undermines NATO, and meets the Kremlin during elections, there's no room for suspicion anymore. We need to wake up and purge this filth out of our countries and out of Europe. We cannot allow foreign mouthpieces to dictate our politics. We need to make supporting Russia a red line. People should absolutely have the right to criticize the EU, NATO, or argue for more radical policies. That's perfectly fine. But openly aligning with a hostile authoritarian regime, one waging war on Europe's doorstep, and allowing foreign leverage to shape our policies cannot be treated as business as usual. I think this is essential to our basic democratic self-preservation, and if Europe is serious about defending its future, that's a line it can no longer afford to blur.